Once you have a state of Israel created, that creates all kinds of other complications. Because if you're just an ethno-religious community, and you're trying to decide who's allowed to pay dues, like that's on the level of extracurricular activity. But once you're a state that defines yourself as a Jewish state, and you want to have preference for Jewish immigrants, you have to define in a legal category with legally binding force who is Jewish and who is not. So shortly after the founding of the state, the law of return was passed. Originally passed in, I don't know the original year, like 52, 53, something like that, very early after the state was founded. So you have that on the next page or on the screen. Every Jew has the right to come to this country as an ole, as an immigrant. They have a special holy visa to every Jew who has expressed desire to settle there, unless the Minister of Immigration decides they're engaged in activity actively directed against the Jewish people, or is likely to endanger public health or the safety of the state. So, a psychopathic killer, they're allowed to say, The certificate. A Jew who has come to Israel and subsequent to his arrival expressed a desire to settle receives an ole certificate, which means you're an immigrant under that law, and again, they can rescind it. Every Jew who immigrated to the country before the coming into force of this law, every Jew born in the country before or after the force of this law is deemed a person who has come to the country as an ole under the law. So they're all counted. Birthright citizenship isn't automatic. There are a lot of countries that don't have birthright citizenship. Well, they had to deal with people that came into the country in 1935.
But every Jew who was born in the country is considered an immigrant?
Well, technically. They're considered to have automatic citizenship is the claim they're trying to make. But the problem with this law was they didn't define what do they mean by Jew here. They just say anybody who's Jewish. Now,
it's not just
Didn't they say,
qualifies one.
didn't they say either father or mother?
right, in the original text it didn't at all. It didn't clarify either way.
Saying they do.
But is it today? What is it? Is that your mother is Jewish?
We'll get there.
Okay.
See the amendment?
Yeah.
Okay. So what happened was you would have cases where people had a father who was Jewish, and they would try to register, and depending on who was in charge of the Office of Registration, they'd either get through or they wouldn't. It was a very haphazard system. They're just starting the state from scratch. And in a couple of early bureaucratic decisions, a bureaucrat says, well, look, he identifies as Jewish, so fine, let him in. They sort of accept self-identification. There was even a precedent for that in Eastern Europe. In the early 1900s, the Jewish Socialist Bund wanted to have elections for local Jewish offices. This was this kind of diaspora nationalism, where it wasn't finding a state separately, but it was doing Jewish ethnic nationalism under the Russian Empire, like Ukrainians could and other peoples, in theory, could. And one of the things they said in there was, who's eligible to vote in this election they want to see? Basically anybody who self-identifies as Jewish. Anyone who describes himself as a member of the Jewish nation. Now, in Tsarist Russia in 1905, there wasn't a huge rush of people who identify as Jewish to sign up just to vote in this election. Right. Or they really were. So, but that was, again, this idea of maybe you could self-identify. There's a precedent to that. But in the end, there was a big debate that happened in the 1960s over a case called Brother Daniel. So Brother Daniel was a Jewish child who was hidden in a monastery during the Holocaust and saw the light and became a Christian, in fact became a monk. And he was stationed at the Carmelite monastery in Israel, I think near Jerusalem. And he decided to apply to become an Israeli citizen under the law of return. He said, I was born Jewish to two Jewish parents. Because he was, hidden in this church and when he was 10 or 11, he has memories. It wasn't like a baby infant. And the fact that he happened to be Christian didn't change his ethnic identity as the child of Jewish parents. It's got all the way to the Supreme Court because it was a very divisive question. And in the end, the Supreme Court decided that you can be Jewish by ethnic background and by Jewish religion. You can be Jewish by ethnic background and not religious. But you can't be Jewish by ethnic background and part of another religion. That would disqualify it. It's like playing for the other, it's rooting for the other team. You can't be on both teams.
Even though it's not a religious state.
Even though it's a semi-religious state. because the chief rabbinate is Orthodox and controls who you can marry and when you get divorced and can you be married. There's no intermarriage in Israel because there's no civil marriage. If a Muslim wants to marry a Christian, they have to leave the state.
How is it not in religious state?
Because the rabbis don't decide who's elected. There's a separate civil court system, and if you get married outside the state, you're recognized legally by the court system. So it's a hybrid
Dual
state.
power.
It has some things that are controlled by religion and some things that are controlled by a secular government that passes laws and has a parliament and has, basic, it's not quite a constitution, but basic laws that have the force of law. And, so it's, you can sell pork in Israel. The rabbis don't like it, and the ultra-Orthodox don't want it in their neighborhoods. You can drive on Shabbat in Israel. You just shouldn't drive through certain neighborhoods. So it's sort of a hybrid of both. And the question of what the government allows and doesn't allow on Shabbat or in personal practice, there was a big debate recently over, during Passover, are you allowed to bring food to your family who's in a hospital? Because if you bring in not kosher for Passover food, does that trade up the whole building for the people who are kosher? Or are you allowed to bring in, so it's this, again, a very hybrid kind of identity. But it becomes a legal question. So in 1970, they amended the law of return to try to clarify it, but in classic government compromise fashion, it's no clearer than it was before. So here it's adding in a clause. The rights of a Jew under this law and the rights of an Olay under the nationality law are also vested in the child and grandchild of a Jew, the spouse of a Jew, the child of a Jew, and the spouse of a grandchild of a Jew, except a person who has been a Jew and voluntarily changed his religion. There's Brother Daniel left out. But notice, it's saying, it's distinguishing two things here. One is, they separate the rights of a Jew and the rights of an Olay, an immigrant. So you can immigrate under the law of return, but that doesn't mean the rabbinate has to recognize you as Jewish. So you can get the right of Israeli citizenship, but not the right to be registered as a Jew. If you are a child or a grandchild of a Jewish person. Do you know where they got that standard of a child or a grandchild of a Jewish person? The Nuremberg laws. Because the Nazis would persecute you if you were a child, or if one grandparent was enough to be marked as a Mischling, as a mixed race person. So ironically, it's ironic, but it makes sense. If you were persecuted by Hitler, you should be allowed in as a refugee. There's something to be said for that.
But why would they give the rabbis that much power in a secular state formed by atheists?
Well, I'll come back to it. So that's one thing they're distinguishing here is the right of being a Jew or the right of an Olay, an immigrant. And secondly, they are clearly expressing they know they might be bringing in non-Jews. The spouse of a Jew, right? So they're Jewish by association, but they're not Jewish themselves. But the idea that the Jewish person would ditch their spouse to move to Israel in a refugee emergency situation is, they didn't want to make that happen, so they allowed the spouse in. And of course, if it's a Jewish man with a non-Jewish woman, they know the kids aren't going to count. But that's why they put in the child of a Jew, or the spouse of a child of a Jew, so even one more step removed. And then 4b, they added in, for the purposes of this law, Jew means a person who was born of a Jewish mother, or has become converted to Judaism and is not a member of another religion. So that's where they throw in the Orthodox definition of Jew means Jewish mother or converted, and the rabbinate gets to decide what counts as conversion. So the question was, why did they give the rabbis this power? Well, two reasons. One is they adopted the Turkish system of personal status law, which is called the millet system, where if you were Muslim, you went to a Muslim religious authority. If you were Jewish, you went to a Jewish religious authority. And there was a Jewish chief rabbi, and there was a chief imam, and a chief priest of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and they had deputies, and that's how you ran the system. And so in the Middle Ages, under the Ottomans, it was very progressive. So Jews didn't have to deal with Muslim authorities to do things. They didn't have their own Jewish authorities. But in the 20th century, it's ridiculous. And there's no space for being secular or for crossing the boundaries. But they just inherited that system. The British kept it in place in the Mandate period, and then the Israeli state kept it too. The other reason was that David Ben-Gurion and the founders were convinced that Orthodoxy was going to die out. They weren't worried about it. So I'll throw them a bone, what's the big deal? We'll write a constitution, it'll be moot anyway. Never got around to it. They never wrote the Constitution. And the Orthodox didn't vanish. And so it was a poor choice at the time. But we're living with it.
Yeah.
So now here we are at the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century. What does it mean to be Jewish today? Well, we have a really a wonderful treasure trove of information from 2013. The Pew Forum on Religion and American Life did a huge survey called Portrait of Jewish Americans. And they asked really good questions. We're going to talk about their answers both in the morning and also in the afternoon some more. So the first question that they asked, that was sort of the headline issue for them, was, is being Jewish mainly a matter of, and they filled in the blank. So you could say ancestry, is it mainly a matter of culture, is it mainly a matter of religion, or is it sort of all of the above? Yeah, they combined the ancestry and culture, but when they asked the question, they said, what do you think Judaism is mainly a matter of? Is it mainly a matter of ancestry? Is it mainly a matter of culture? Is it mainly a matter of religion? Or is it a mix of all those things?
How many did they survey?
I'd have to go back and look, but it was several thousand. It was not a small number. They really did a good job.
And all throughout.
Yeah, across the country, in the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah. So notice some of the numbers here. If you're looking at the being Jewish, what does it mean? Overall, net Jewish, 62% of Jews said it's
Yeah, that's
an issue of ancestry or culture. And only 15% said it was only a religion. And 23% said it was both religion and ancestry culture. Now the next category, they break it out of Jews by religion and Jews of no religion.
Wow.
What that means is they would ask you, what's your religion? And if they said Jewish, they went to Jew by religion. If they said, what's your religion? And you say, I'm not religious, then they'd say, do you consider yourself Jewish in some other way? If you say yes, then you're a Jew of no religion, because you said you weren't religious, but you still are Jewish in some way. But notice, even among Jews by religion, 55% said it's mostly ancestry and culture, and only 17% said it's mostly religion. The men and women breakdown is very similar. Even look at the denominational breakdown. Now this is interesting. Among the Orthodox, still 15% said it's mainly ancestry and culture, but 46% said religion. But for conservative Jews, 48% said it's ancestry and culture.
Huh.
For Reform Jews, 67% said it's ancestry and culture, and it makes sense. No denomination would say, yeah, that it's ancestry and culture. Right? So most American Jews, 2/3 of them overall, would say that being Jewish is mainly a matter of ancestry and culture. And then if you add up ancestry, culture, and religion and ancestry and culture, you got 85%. I mean, the vast majority think that there's an ethnic component to being Jewish. Now look at the one on the right. They ask, what's compatible with being Jewish? Can you be Jewish if you, and here are some fill in the blanks, if you work on the Sabbath? 94% say yes, you can be Jewish if you work on Shabbat. And the Jews by religion, Jews of no religion, everyone agrees, working on Shabbat, no big deal. Can you be Jewish if you're strongly critical of Israel? Again, a very overwhelming number say yes, you can still be Jewish if you're strongly critical of Israel.
Wow.
And
That's a surprise.
But look
no,
at
it's
the
not. In reality, it's not.
well, you can't, they might say you're a bad Jew, but it doesn't disqualify you from being Jewish at all.
I know, but in today's political climate, they're kind of saying, yeah.
But they're critical, and you're still Jewish. Like if you're pro-Palestinian,
Right.
that's what you're thinking.
The question here is, you see, it's not asking, is this an idealized situation where they should be this? It's saying, are they allowed to still call themselves Jewish if they're in that category? And again, 90% would still say yes. That's what gets people mad. If they thought they were non-Jews criticizing Israel, they just ignore them, just like they do all the Palestinian organizations. And the Students for Justice in Israel or in Palestine, whatever, they just ignore them or, do other things. But it's that they're claiming to be Jewish and being critical of Israel. Like, pisses people off even more.
Well, I was
How
just,
dare you traitor?
Right.
yeah, well, of course, I'm going to get into politics and I shouldn't, but
That's okay.
that's exactly what he's trying to portray.
I know, but the organized Jewish community is doing it too. It's not just the government. Okay, next one. This one again is very interesting. Can you be Jewish if you don't believe in God? 68% of overall Jews said yes.
I don't quite get that. Because isn't the premise of Judaism about one God? No?
Not if it's ancestry and culture. Remember? If being Jewish is about ancestry and culture, then you can not believe in that God. And besides, what it started with and what it is now can be very different. And we saw it didn't start with monotheism. It started with a national identity that was polytheistic and then evolved into it. So, you know, we hear sort of the ad slogans, the propaganda version of Judaism started with Abraham, the first monotheist,
Yeah,
but that's not what happened historically. And
because
that isn't who we are now.
this is my mother. She does
Right.
not believe in God. She's definitely identified as Jew.
Right, exactly. Everybody knows somebody like this. I mean, that's the point. That it's very hard to deny their Jewishness when they're so Jewish. And I use the example sometimes. Are Adam Sandler or Amy Schumer Jewish? Yes. Does Adam Sandler believe in God? Does Amy Schumer believe in God? Who knows? But it doesn't make a difference. It doesn't change the answer to that first question. Their belief or not, their kosher practice or not, makes no difference for that question. And then the next one, this one was more controversial. Can a person be Jewish if he or she believes Jesus was the Messiah?
Wow, I'm surprised there's even 34%.
Right, that was what was shocking.
Wow.
That people thought it should have been an 80% no. But again, if you take the ancestry culture thing seriously, then maybe if it's ancestry, then there's the brother Daniel's still Jewish.
Huh.
So again, we're still living in this hybrid world of ethnic, religious. There's still some religious things that are beyond the pale, but atheism is not as bad as it used to be. Right? It's not like the Mishnah where they said the Apikoros is out. It's not like Maimonides who said you have to believe Maimonides would have a cow with these results.
But it's not really mentioned
They'd have a pig, I guess.
until we come along. Then,
Oh, there's been atheist Jews for a long time.
I know,
We didn't push this number.
but my experience is that people are quiet about it until you say, hey, but I'm a secular Jew. And they're like, oh, well, I guess I am too.
Well, but I mean, there have been secular Jews for 100 years too.
Sure.
And there were Jewish anarchists who would run a Yom Kippur ball, with a buffet. That was their Yom Kippur observance. Unless you think it's a joke, or some kind of quirky thing, the last Yom Kippur ball was held in New York City in 1939, I think. Madison Square Garden, they had 20,000 people come to this Yom Kippur ball. I mean, some of them might have been not Jewish, spouses of people, whatever, but still, that's a big turnout for us, thumb your nose kind of an activity. So yeah, I mean, that number has definitely shifted from what it might have been in the past, but also that identifying by ancestry and culture has shifted too. We'll actually see that in the afternoon, I think.
Do you think that this survey was done today would be much different?
Oh, 6 years or 7 years on? Probably not that different.
No.
I don't think so. I mean, if anything, more so. I think people are becoming more secularized. As one example, that number about Jews of no religion, about 25% of the American Jewish community identified as Jews of no religion. So they said, I'm not religious, but I'm Jewish in some other way. But among millennials, it was 33%. Older people were more likely to say they're Jewish by religion, whatever that meant to them. But younger people are more willing to say, I'm not religious. And that's true of the general population too. About a third of millennials of all American types are what are called the nones, N-O-N-E-S, who are not religious. They might be spiritual, they might be sort of freelance monotheists, but they just don't identify with a particular religious institution or tradition.
Right.
So let's jump on a little bit in the last few minutes we have. So our movement in 1988 issued a statement on who is Jewish, where we said very explicitly, and this is near the bottom of that statement, so probably on the next sheet, that a Jew for us is a person of Jewish descent. We said descent like any background. This is the last paragraph of the resolution.
Text page resolution.
Yep. So a Jew is a person of Jewish descent, either side, either parent, however far back. We didn't get into the percentages, This is before 23andMe, but we didn't want to get into that. Or any person who declares himself or herself to be a Jew and who identifies with the history, ethical values, culture, civilization, community, and faith of the Jewish people. There's no one way to do that. You don't have to go to a mikveh. You don't have to be circumcised. You can join a Jewish community. You can study Jewish history. You can celebrate Jewish holidays. You can move to a Jewish state. You can work for Jewish continuity in the future.
If you don't do any of those, do you still be a Jew?
If you're of Jewish descent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but someone who just says, yeah, I'm Jewish, but doesn't do anything and isn't active and isn't part of the community and doesn't have a descent, then that's like me saying I'm Japanese. If I can say it, it's not going to make it true. So we wanted to be more open and flexible, but also to understand that there are going to be people who want to join our community who are not going to be religious. And they shouldn't have to go through a religious conversion to become part of the Jewish family. So that's really the language that we tend to use, is a family. You can be born into a family, you could be adopted into a family. We tend to use the word adoption rather than conversion. You can disown a family if you want to quit. You can sign out, change your name, say I'm not Jewish anymore. Yeah, you divorce, right, you leave the family. And so I let people decide to not be Jewish if they've decided they're of Jewish heritage, but they signed up. I used the analogy last night. I wouldn't want Jewishness to be like the Hotel California, where you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. Some people think of it that way. You're stuck, you're Jewish, that's it. But my approach is, yes, you can leave. If you want to sign out, I'll sign you out, but I get to stay in. And I'm checked in, I'm not checked out. So I also include here some examples of how Israelis identify religiously. I'll point out again that you have a number of people who move along the spectrum of religion. You get some people who become more religious, and some people become less religious. That happens in Israel, it happens in America too. And notice how Israel is divided. 42% in 2008 identified as secular.
This is 2008?
Yeah, it's about 12 years.
That's a long time.
Okay. The more recent numbers are probably like 35%. And the Masorti, the traditional one, is a little more, and the Orthodox is a little more.
That's the way the world is going.
But it's still the largest single group still identifies as secular in some way in Israel. Also in America, you'll notice in the 2013 study, and we'll talk more about more current Israeli numbers in the afternoon. In America, notice the change. So if you add up the columns vertically, they add up to 100%, because it's all the people who said they were raised, if you do it, yes.
Raised Orthodox now.
Right. So they're currently Orthodox, and raised Orthodox means 48%. But
it changes.
those who are currently conservative and raised conservative is only 36%. Most conservative Jews went somewhere else. So the vertical column is all those raised Orthodox, all those raised conservative. So of those raised Orthodox, 48% stayed Orthodox, 15% became conservative, 14% became Reform, 11% became Reform, 14% became other or nothing, 5% are not religious, and 6% are not Jewish. But that means half of those raised Orthodox left it, didn't stay Orthodox. But only a third of those raised conservative stayed conservative. A lot of them became Reform. A good chunk of that is from intermarriage, because conservative is still rejecting intermarriage. And some of them became secular. A lot of those raised Reform stayed Reform because they were already flexible to begin with. But some of them became not religious. And some of those raised, no particular denomination stayed. But some became not Jewish at all. And a smaller number became more Orthodox. So what we think of as the Baal Teshuvah, the becoming Orthodox world, is actually a smaller percent of the American Jewish community than you think of.
What is the current definition of conservative and Reform?
Well, you could define it as being affiliated with the movements that call themselves conservative and Reform. Conservative Jews, the synagogue is always kosher. They believe in a process of Jewish law. Whereas Reform is more, you make your own choices. So if women want to wear a talit and a kippah, they can. By the way, if you go into a Reform temple and you say, I don't want to wear a kippah, they don't make you do it. It's a personal choice of whether you put it on or not. Whereas in a conservative synagogue, they would say, you want to be in the sanctuary, you got to wear a kippah. You want to be on the bima, you have to have a talis on. And women have to have their head covered in some way. And they have rules. that they stick to. The Reform is a little more flexible. But they both use a lot of Hebrew in their services. The conservative prayer book is closer to an Orthodox one, and the Reform is a little more flexible, a little more modern in English. So now jump down to the last one. Here we have a breakdown by denominations and how important is being Jewish in your life. We'll end in a few more minutes. So the current denominational identification, again, as of 2013, so it may have shifted a little bit, but you can't do a big survey every year. So of all Jews, 35% call themselves Reform, 18% conservative, 10% Orthodox, and no denomination was 30%. And the vast majority of no denomination was just Jewish. Didn't call themselves atheist agnostic, didn't call themselves culturally Jewish, they just said, I'm just Jewish. Just no denomination, I'm not going to face it. And then a few showed up in other denominations, like Reconstructionist, or Progressive, or Jewish Renewal. I think Humanistic Judaism fit under others mixed. We were somewhere jumbled in there. So, again, the largest group is Reform. The second largest is none of the above. And Orthodox is only about 10%. Now, you'll periodically get people who write articles saying, the Orthodox are going to take over, they're going to grow, and look at all the kids they have. And I point out to them two things. One is, remember the one about denominational shift? Half of those raised Orthodox don't identify as Orthodox anymore. So that's going to slow down that rate of takeover. And secondly, in 1990, the National Jewish Population Study asked the same question as this. And it showed there were about 10% of American Jews were Orthodox. In 2000, a National Jewish Population Study asked the same question. It showed about 10% of American Jews were Orthodox. In 2013, they asked the same question. It showed about 10% of American Jews are Orthodox. So their proportion of the American Jewish population is staying relatively steady over 25 years. And you'd think that birth rate, it's not like they're having more kids now than they were 20 years ago, it's the same number. But
So that means people
a lot of
are actually leaving.
people are leaving and not identifying as Orthodox over time. And look, we get members of our communities that come from an Orthodox background. My father had that evolution in his lifetime. And you know, what they're doing is they're feeding the Reform and conservative movements. These ex-Orthodox people that wind up there are providing numbers for those movements that may be having a harder time replacing their numbers. And then finally, that question of how important is being Jewish in your life. After all, an ethnic identity can be a big deal, or it could be a, anecdote of history background. It doesn't have to define your life. So overall, 46% said being Jewish is very important in their life. 34% said, somewhat, and 20% said, no big deal. But notice, Jews by religion are more likely to say it's important, and Jews of no religion are more likely to say it's not very or not at all important. This is one of the reasons why this survey alarmed people, because they saw a third of Jewish millennials are Jews of no religion, and if they think being Jewish is not that important in their life, then what happens in 20 years or 30 years? Do they even bother giving their kids any Jewish experience or not, if it's not that important to them? Maybe they wouldn't even bother. Again, notice the Orthodox numbers for them is very important in their life, but for Reform Jews, 40% very important, 40% somewhat important. And for the no denomination ones, still for 20% of those who say they're no denomination, being Jewish is very important in their life. So there's reason for hope, there's reason for concern, but in terms of our topic for the morning of defining what it means to be Jewish, I hope this gives you some perspective of the varieties of ways that people connect to it. For some, it's a really important part of their life in a religious sense, and for others, in a secular sense, and for others, it's not a big deal, and it's a cultural ancestry piece, and they don't even care if you believe in Jesus anymore, because that's just ancestry. It's like an anecdote of biography. It's not a particularly defining characteristic of who they are. So when we come back in the afternoon, we're going to shift to talking about doing Jewish, because that's a conversation the Jewish community is having right now. If the being Jewish is so complicated and divisive, and who counts and who doesn't, and where do we all fit, maybe it'll be more successful if we focus on getting people to do Jewish things. 50 years ago, we thought if you make people feel Jewish, then they'll do Jewish things. They'll They'll join synagogues, they'll donate to federations, they'll send their kids to Israel or some Jewish summer camps. That being would lead to doing automatically. And now they're realizing that just being, you could be not that important. You guess I'm Jewish, but it's not a big deal. So maybe the doing needs to happen as well, or maybe even first, or with a different emphasis. And if it's doing Jewish, non-Jewish spouses can make hamantashen, they can spin dreidels, they can participate in seders. And so maybe the doing Jewish is a way of encouraging the family to be more connected to Jewish life, as opposed to focusing on the being Jewish, you're in, you're out, you're welcome, you're not, and the bouncers are keeping people out.
I think of it